Okay, I'm going to go ahead and end that poll and share the results. Looks like most of you are joining us from Title 1 or 3, or you're another WIOA partner. And if you are the other WIOA partner, we have board staff, IDES state data team, and the university research partner for DCEO. Now Antonio's going to launch the other two polls.
Perfect. All right, and this poll will be, which LWIA do you represent?
And this is fill in the blank, so please just put the number of the LWIA. That works for us. That should be good, Antonio. We can end that poll, and then we
Perfect.
don't need to share the results because it's just fill in the blank, and we'll share the other poll.
Perfect. So I'm going to go ahead and launch the third poll. This one, is this your first WIOA planning cycle? You can answer that yes or no.
That one would be nice to see the results of that. Would be good.
Yeah, we can definitely share that. Okay, we're going to go ahead and end that poll and share the results. As we can see, 41% has said yes and 59% has said no in this poll. All right, I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing those results, and we can hand this off to Mike Baker to start the presentation.
Welcome, everyone. 41% newbies. That is great. And I guess the remainder grizzled veterans. So that's great, too, that everyone's hanging around. At our last bi-monthly phone call with the local Title I leaders, I asked them if they would be interested in having a high-level overview of the data packets for the planning process. And I was delighted to get a very enthusiastic yes. So that's why we're having this webinar today, to give you all kind of the highlights of the data packet that we're putting together that is customized for each of the 10 economic development regions. We plan on releasing the full data packets to everybody later this month. Depending on what comes out of this webinar today, if people have additional questions or additional information they would like us to try to gather, we can take a look at that. If not a whole lot of new stuff comes out, then we're hoping packets will be released sooner in the month rather than later. But our goal is, for sure, by the time Halloween gets here, we'll have these out and on the street for you all to be looking at. This is sort of the first step in kicking off the planning process at the regional and local level for the next cycle. There's a webinar on the 11th next week that will cover, coming MOU guidance tweaks, planning guidance for the regional and local plans, and a few other things. So this conversation today kind of dovetails into that. So there'll be more information on planning coming next week. And as I alluded to, part of our goal today is to solicit feedback. Our goal is to make the data as accessible and meaningful to you all as possible. So we would like feedback on, are we giving you data that matters to you? And are we giving it to you in a way that's understandable and actionable? Both for putting in your WIOA plans, but also for better understanding what's happening in your region, both in a demographic way and also for labor market information. We have a couple of new slides that we've never done before. that we want to cover today. And then we've also kind of tweaked and reworked some data that in the past that was provided in a table and put them into a more graphic presentation. And at the end, we also want to introduce you to the regional economists from the Department of Employment Security. And we'll make those introduction and encourage interaction between local planning teams, regional planning teams, and your assigned IDS economists. So we'll come to that later. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Andy Blanke from NIU. He'll go over the highlights of our data packet and encourage interaction and feedback and questions, and we'll try to answer those as best we can. So Andy, take it away, and we'll sit back and watch here. Thank you.
I'm sorry about that. I was having some technical difficulties all day. I'm terribly sorry about that. Without further ado, hopefully we can get started. So this is going to be a preview of updated WIOA regional data packets for 2024. Just a quick overview of what we hope to accomplish in this meeting. We're going to give you a preview of the data packets for next year. We'll discuss some potential changes that we hope to implement before we get those data packets out to all the regions. And then we'll discuss some next steps based on the feedback that we hope to gather at this meeting and over the next couple of days. So just a recap of some of the changes we implemented from previous data packets. First of all, we tried to improve them in terms of organization, try to make things flow better, make it easier to read. So in past years, these data packets had a lot of information, but it was maybe not organized the best way possible. You'd see some demographic trends on one page, then the next page down, you would see some economic forecasts, and then the next page would be talking about demographics again. Now we tried to organize it so that we have all the demographics in one section, all the economic trends in another section, and then a final section on labor market alignment, or how does local labor market supply meet the demand for job openings. We also are adding some more narrative context to the data packet. So a picture is worth 1,000 words, but sometimes a word is worth 1,000 pictures. So we try to give some more narrative to help you understand what's being shown and what is missing on each given data table and each visualization. And for some of the more sophisticated, more complex analyses, we added notes pages as needed, just so we're completely transparent about what this data is, where it came from, what it's telling us, and what is missing in that data. So just an overview of what's included in the data packets. We have 3 sections. One of them is the demographic overview, things like population trends, race, ethnicity, target populations, and so on. And there's recent employment trends, looking at the labor force participation, the unemployment rate, how employment has changed over the last year and since the economic peak in 2019. And then some analysis of leading, emerging, and maturing sectors. For those that are new to this planning process, those 3 terms might be new to you, but we will define those in the data packets and in this presentation. And then the third section is labor market alignment. So looking at how does the supply of potential workers fit the demand in terms of projected job openings by education level. So without further ado, let's get into what is included in these data packets. So after this meeting, we'll be sharing a working draft of the data packet template, which is about 64 pages of graphics and narrative. We're not going to go through all 64 pages of that report today. Just for this demonstration and to give you a taste of things to come, I'm going to go through 5 highlights from each of the 3 sections. So it's going to be 15 of what we thought would be some of the most interesting findings to showcase from the data packets to give you an idea of what you're looking for and hopefully helps steer a direction for what kind of things you'd like to see added or modified or improved. So the first section is the demographic overview. The data packets will have a divider page for each section, something like that. One of the key points we are including is the total population over time for your region. So we have the line graph showing the total population each year from 2010 through 2022. That's the most recent as of the census's population estimates each year. These aren't based on the American Community Survey. These are a separate Census Bureau product, which gives us the population in each specific year. So if you're looking at American Community Survey, the population counts are going to be different. That's because that's more of a time-lapse photography over the 5 years. That's not the best snapshot of the single year populations, which we have included here. Along the lower right side of this page, we have callouts showing what percentage of the state population your region represented in 2010 and in 2022. That percentage is pretty stable in most regions. So in previous versions of these data packets, we would show a line graph with a share of the state, but that didn't tell a good story because the share is pretty stable from year to year. And then along the right side of this page is a breakout of the population by county in your region. So just seeing in your region which counties are really driving that total population, which ones are larger, which ones are smaller. Another indicator we're including is the composition of the population in each region by race and ethnicity. In past years, we included a lot of different tabulations on income by race and target populations, that sort of thing, but we didn't have a simple snapshot of, well, how much of our population is white, how much of our population is African American, how much of our population is Hispanic, and so on. So on this page, we have 2 simple bar graphs. The first one showing the percentage of the population by each racial and ethnic group, and then the total count in each of those groups. And on this page, the Hispanic ethnicity includes any race, and then every other group is non-Hispanic. So on this graph, about 84% of the population is white, non-Hispanic. About 2.6% is Hispanic of any race. So if someone is African American and Hispanic, they would be included as Hispanic. If they're African American, non-Hispanic, then they would be included in the African American category. And we include that just to keep the composition simple. In some data sources, Hispanic ethnicity overlaps with race, and then we end up with percentages that exceed 100%. Another indicator we include in the population section is some information on the composition of persons below the poverty level. So we have the breakouts by age, by sex, by race and ethnicity, and by educational attainment. So we present these both as the percentages and as the counts on 2 separate pages. Just here are the counts of the population in poverty, so you can just see what are some of the more detailed characteristics for people with low income in your region. Beyond the poverty threshold, there's also some research by the United Way on what is called an ALICE threshold. So ALICE stands for Asset Limited, Income Constrained, Employed Persons. So ALICE households are those that have income above the poverty level, but they still might have difficulty making ends meet. So these are people that are probably employed, but probably not in occupations that could pay a living wage. They still have some difficulty paying some bills. So on this page, that line graph is showing the trend in the count of households at poverty level and at the ALICE threshold over time. The brighter blue line is the ALICE households. The darker blue line is the poverty households. There are generally fewer households at the poverty threshold than at the ALICE threshold because it's a stricter threshold, lower income. Along the bottom, we have 2 bar graphs comparing the share of the households at poverty level and at the ALICE threshold in the region and the state. Now, in both of these bar graphs, the brighter blue bar is your region, the darker blue bar is the state. Now, be careful with these bar graphs because the legend is different for them. So you see on the bars on the left side, the tallest bar is 14.4%, but on the bar on the right, the shortest bar is 23.1%. There's a different scale because these different household types represent a different share of the population overall. There are generally more Alice households than poverty households. Regardless, they both give us an understanding of what types of people in our region might have more difficulty making ends meet with their current earnings. And then along the right side of this page, we have a breakout of the Alice households by county within your region. And then those dollar amounts next to the population is the income thresholds that the United Way defined for that Alice threshold. So if a household has less than that income and they're above the poverty level, then they would be an Alice household. And that information will be provided for each region in the data packets. We also provide some information on counts of the target population by several dimensions. In past versions of the data packets, we had this presented as a table that was a lot to take in. This time we tried to break it out into some bar graphs that are easier to interpret. So one dimension of target populations is various communities involved in the justice system. So we have counts of the adult prison population, the parole population, and the juvenile justice population. Note that in most regions, the juvenile population is significantly lower than for the adult prison and parole populations. And in some economic development regions, they don't have a juvenile detention facility, so that bar might not appear for some of the packets. Then we also have some counts of the youth in the foster care system and what type of care they're receiving. Are they in the care of a relative? Are they in the general foster care program? Are they in group homes, or so on? We have counts for other target populations as well in the data packets, but this page is one of the examples of how it's being visualized. So those are some of the indicators we have on the demographic overview in the data packets. Now we're going to turn to recent employment trends. So these are things like what's happening to employment in each industry sector. Is employment up or down since the peak of the economy in 2019 before COVID? What are some of the leading and emerging industries? These are the sort of things covered in this section. So on this bar graph, we're showing the change in total non-farm employment from second quarter of 2019 to today, second quarter of 2023. At the time that we generated these packets, second quarter 2023 was the most recent available, so we just compare Q2 19 to Q2 23 just so we have an apples to apples comparison before the COVID downturn compared to today. So on this graph, we're showing how does each region stack up compared to the state in terms of recovery in employment. The black bar is the change in statewide total employment. So overall, the state lost less than 1% of employment between Q2 19 and Q2 23. There were 4 regions that gained employment since 2019. The others all lost employment to varying degrees. So this bar graph shows how does your region stack up in terms of total employment recovery. If your region shows up above the black bar, that means that they generally performed somewhat better than the state overall. Another addition is the bubble chart, which shows employment changes over several dimensions. So along the x-axis, going left to right, that's showing the employment change in each industry sector, such as manufacturing, construction, healthcare. Going up and down on the chart on the y-axis, that's showing a location quotient, or a concentration of employment in the sector. So the way to calculate a location quotient is it's a comparison of the importance of employment in that industry for your region compared to the importance of employment in that industry for nationwide employment. So if manufacturing represents 10% of employment in the nation and it represents 10% of employment in your region, that would be a location quotient of 1. If there's a region with manufacturing representing 30% of employment, well, it represents 10% of employment in the national employment situation, then that would be a location quotient of 3. So high location quotients are areas where your region might have a competitive advantage in that industry because that industry represents more of your employment base than it would following the national patterns. And then in the bubble chart, the size of each bubble indicates the total employment size as of 2022. And the employment changes are based on a forecast that IDES provided for 2022 to 2030. And the main part that we want to focus on for this bar graph is the upper right section, which are our leading industries. By leading industries, we mean these are the industries where they're projected to grow. They have a strong concentration of employment in terms of the location quotients. So these are industries that are already strong in the region, and they're expected to become even more important to the employment base in the future. Another area of interest are maturing industries. This is the upper left corner of the graph. These are industries that have a strong concentration of employment, but they're projected to lose employment over the next 8 years. So these are sectors that are still important for the region's employment base, but they might be losing some of that employment in the future. They're still important from a retention perspective and trying to mitigate employment losses. Another area of interest is the emerging industries. These are in the lower right section of the map. So emerging industries are those that are projected to gain employment over the next 8 years, but they have a relatively lower concentration of employment right now. So these are industries that aren't necessarily major strengths in the region yet, but they are trending in that direction. So those might be worth some consideration for how can we train people that can support these industries as it continues to grow? How can we possibly improve the location quotient in these sectors as those forecasts carry out? In addition to the bubble charts, we also provide this graph that just shows within your region, how does each industry stack up compared to total employment? On this graph, the black bar shows the change in total non-farm employment from 2019 to 2023. Then each of the bars above the line performed better than the average employment in your region. Each bar below the black line had more employment losses than the total. Now, these percentages are all relative to the size of the employment in that industry. If you look at the yellow boxes that I drew around natural resources and mining, that's because it's a very steep employment decline, but it's also a small industry in terms of employment size. So the natural resources sector lost 28% of its employment since 2019. But as of 2022, it also only represented 390 jobs. So it's a big percentage loss, but it's not necessarily a lot of jobs lost because it's a very small industry in the cosmic scheme of the region. We're looking at about 200,000 jobs overall in the central region compared to 400 in natural resources and mining. We provide those total employment counts so you have more context behind the percentage changes. So is it a big growth in a big industry, or is it a large percentage change in a small industry? And then we also provide some graphs showing, not necessarily since COVID, but how has employment changed just over the past year in each region. So each of these bar graphs is showing the trend in a different industry, comparing how your region stacks up. So in each of these graphs, the black bar shows the statewide trend just over the past year, and then each of the regions is placed above or below that based on how that sector performed over that year. To be clear that each of these bars is showing a different industry, we show them each with a different color. So the blue bars are showing total non-farm employment, yellow is showing construction, and so on. We have several pages so you can see these breakouts for each industry, for each region. But just as this example, we show the first page with construction, education and healthcare, and financial activities. That education and health services sector, that might seem unusual to some of you. You might wonder, why are those two categories combined? Education and health services are two very different sectors. The reason that's provided that way is so that IDES can provide information for every region. The thing is that in some of the regions with a smaller employment base, IDES might not be able to publish the information on education and health services sector separately without making the characteristics of individual employers disclosable. In the interest of providing data for every single region, education and health services are being combined in this bar graph. And then we also provide some maps showing the change in employment within each region at a county level for each industry. We provide maps for each of the sectors that were shown previously, but just as an example for this presentation, we're giving the maps for the information sector. Now, by information as the industry, that's different from information technology occupations. The information sector includes things like publishing, telecommunications, and data processing. So a lot of IT occupations, like IT consultants, those are included in other industries. So on the map on the left, we're showing the year-over-year employment change in each county. Brighter blue indicates more employment growth. Darker orange indicates more employment declines. The counties shaded in black did not have enough data to publish in those individual counties. Now, the reason we like showing this employment by county is because the regional trend can mask a lot of the churn that happens within regions. So the region might be growing overall, but there might be counties that are losing employment within that region. Conversely, if you look at the region-wide change, that region might be losing employment, but there might be some counties within the region that are performing really well, that are gaining jobs despite the region-wide loss. And then the map on the right shows location quotients. So this is the concentration of employment in that county. How important is the information sector for the total employment base? On this map, the darker orange shows the lower location quotient, so areas where it's less important to the total employment base. The darker blue indicates a stronger concentration of employment. Note that in the information sector, we're seeing a lot of orange, so it does not represent a large share of employment in most of the industries. In the data packet draft we're sharing, we'll be including maps for every sector, but we're providing just information as a demonstration for this. And the third section we're going to go through is labor market alignment. So this is showing how does the supply of educational completers fit with the demand in terms of job openings. And we also include several characteristics of that. So on this bar graph, we're showing educational enrollments and completions for 2022. Note that the bars are separate colors because education enrollments and completions are two separate cohorts. If someone's in a short-term certificate, chances are they will probably complete that certificate program this year. But for something longer term, people that enroll this year aren't going to be completing this year. So be careful with comparing enrollments to completions directly. Something else to consider in these annual data is that if there are a lot of completions one year, that might not persist in the future based on waves of enrollment. So if there are a lot of people enrolled this year, they might not be reflected in the completions until several years later. Regardless, this is giving us a snapshot of how many people recently earned some sort of degree and how many people are still in the pipeline working towards that degree. We have to be careful with these completer data because completers aren't necessarily always available workers. We'll go through several situations where that might be the case later, but regardless, it gives us one indicator of people that might potentially be in the supply or pipeline for job openings. Besides just the total degree level enrollments and completions, we also provide this information within each degree level. So this bar graph is showing the enrollments and completions for the top 10 programs within the central region. So most of the enrollments and the completions at a bachelor's degree level were for business, management, and marketing. We provide this information also at a master's degree level and a doctorate level. And we also have a separate section with a deep dive on completions in the community college system. This information on the bachelor's degrees, master's degrees, and doctorates is brand new to the data packets this year. And this information is showing community college completions by career cluster. So the taller bars indicate areas where there were more completions in the community college system for your district as of the most recent fiscal year. Now note the two bars at the bottom, the associate's transfer and the general education core curriculum credential. These don't necessarily map to career clusters, because if someone's in an associate transfer, they're pursuing further education. And that general education one, that also can lead to something else. So these are completions that are making people more employable in the future, but they don't map specifically to one occupation. Excluding those two bars, the largest career cluster by completions in the central region was health science, and that trend is pretty consistent in a lot of other regions. So the health science career cluster includes things like registered nursing, nursing assistant, healthcare practitioners, and so on. Those are high demand occupations, so we tend to see a lot of completions in that. One more caution with this ICCB data on completions is that these aren't necessarily individuals with a credential. These are completions, and there are stackable credentials. So if one person is taking a series of short-term credentials in an industry, that would show up as multiple completions, but it would in reality be one individual with each of those credentials. Something else to consider is that just because someone has that credential doesn't necessarily mean they're going directly into the labor market in your region. They might be pursuing stackable credentials, they might be pursuing higher education, or they might be an international student that is going to return to their home countries for work. So there are some cases where completers don't necessarily find employment in the region, but it's a potential aspect of the labor market supply and pipeline. And then tying together the demand for openings and the educational completers, we do something called a gap analysis. So the gap ratio measures the supply versus the demand. So if a gap ratio is 1, that means there is one educational completer in your region for every job opening. If the gap ratio is greater than 1, that means that there are more completers than there are job openings. That's great for employers because it means they might be able to be more selective in hiring the best candidate for the job. When the gap ratio is less than 1, that means that there are fewer completers than job openings. That can be more favorable from the job seeker's perspective if they're competing with fewer potentially qualified applicants. Both are of interest for workforce development planning because the high gap ratios might be areas where the region is already doing a good job of getting people in the pipeline for these high demand occupations. The areas where there's a low gap ratio, those are places where the region might be able to make more of an immediate impact on the labor market by getting more people ready for these jobs that have projected openings. A caveat of the gap analysis is that it doesn't include true on-the-job training or apprenticeships. It's only a comparison of educational completers at formal education completion in relation to the job openings. But we know that in some cases, the job can be filled by someone that did not formally complete some education related to it in the past year. Now, here are some more limitations of the gap analysis. In the data packets, we include a full narrative on this, but this is just an excerpt from that. There are several cases where the gap ratio might understate the supply, or it makes it look like a job is hard to fill when it might not necessarily be the case. So one case where a gap ratio might be understating the supply is when the employer provides on-the-job training. These are cases where it might not be an issue if someone doesn't have the education typically linked with that occupation because they're going to learn how to do the job once they are hired. Another case where the completers don't match the supply is when someone is qualified for the job based on their past work experience or from apprenticeships. So they don't have that formal educational credential, but they're regardless prepared for the job based on what they've used to do. Another case is where a job is filled by underemployed people. So these are people that have a degree, they could apply for the job if it was available. They just did not complete that program in the most recent year. And then there's the issue of commuting and remote work. So just because there aren't completers that got their degree in that region, they could still move to the region to fill that job, or it might be a job that can be done in a remote or hybrid work situation, in which case, again, the employer can find the employee they need without that person necessarily having completed their degree in the region. On the flip side, there are several scenarios where the gap ratio overstates the supply. These would be cases where there are a lot of completers, but they aren't necessarily going into jobs located in your region. One case where this happens is when there's job turnover. There might be cases where someone is really excited to go into a specific line of work based on what they learned in the classroom, and they try it in the workplace and they realize this isn't what I was hoping for. Then they go and pursue education for something else, for a career change. So that would be a case where there are completers, but they aren't staying retained in the industry. Another case where the completers don't translate to employment is when the people that earned a degree in the region commute out for work or they relocate. So they might have earned the degree in your region, but then they aren't working in the region. This would also be the case for remote work. So they're still living in your region, they still got the degree in your region, but their employer is physically located outside of the region. And then there's a case of stackable credentials where someone completed a degree, but they're not entering the labor market just yet. They're still upgrading their skills even further for a better opportunity further down the road. And then in some programs, they might attract lots of international students. This would show up as a lot of educational completers, but not necessarily people that are all going to work in that region when they're done. So some international students might not stay in the region when they're done with the program. So it shows up as a lot of completions, but not necessarily people that are going to be hired by the employers with the job openings in your region. So that's a summary of some of the highlights from the data packets we would like to update for next year. At the end of this meeting, we'll share a full draft example of the packet, and we'd like to get your feedback by the end of Wednesday next week about things that you'd like to see added, improved, clarified. If you have any sort of questions on things you'd like to see added or made clearer, we'd like to make these as useful as possible for all of you. We want to make these data packets make your job of regional planning easier. So please help us help you do that. Marty and I will be available for any general discussion of the data packets and the data that went into them. But we also have several IDES regional labor market economists that are ready to work you through any questions you might have for more specialized questions that really apply to your region in particular. We're going to be coordinating with IDES to make sure that we can reasonably provide the information that each region needs to make this regional planning process as easy as possible from a data perspective. Now, some of the data we are going to add might be reflected in all the data packets. Some of them might be some more specialized requests that will be provided to regions individually. We will coordinate for the best approach for that based on the feedback we receive after this meeting. So for general contacts, you can contact me or Marty using this information here. And then for your friendly neighborhood IDES regional economists, all their information are provided here. All of this information will be provided in the slides at the end of this meeting. And with that, I can take any questions you might have. Thank you.
Everyone should have the capacity to unmute themselves. If you could raise your hand first, and then we can go ahead and call on you, and you can just unmute yourself whenever you're called upon. Looks like Caroline Portluck has a question.
Hi, my question is about the effect that the Clean Energy Jobs Act's going to have on this data. I'm assuming we will have to include clean energy jobs in our plans moving forward, but I don't see where the data is going to support that, those initiatives.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. Perhaps Brian can speak to that if he's on the line. My impression was that those specific clean energy jobs are sort of a moving packet. We'd love to include it once we have that operationalized.
Yeah, good question. That the challenge with excuse me, the clean energy jobs is a lot of them are kind of not parsed out in the data, like that they're in the electrician employment. So they're electricians with some sort of specialized skill. They're in plumbing with some of the clean energy water heater sorts of things that get installed. So it's really difficult to especially have projections about those when, first of all, they're not easily defined in the way the existing data are organized, and second of all of the state and federal investment that goes into that sector, it's difficult to get that incorporated into the projections. I don't know if Marty can follow up on how that's kind of investment plays into the projections. But Carolyn, I think this is the second time I've tried to respond to this question from you, and probably neither time was the response very satisfying, unfortunately, because it's difficult when the economy is changing and doesn't really match the way the data are collected and reported. It's really difficult for these sectors.
We're all following the federal infrastructure for these economic and workforce data collections, and the federal infrastructure is very slow to update for some of these things. So we're still using the national level, still using that old classification by what you're doing on the job, not necessarily how you're doing it. So those standard industries and occupations don't really give us a good understanding of clean construction or so on.
Don't worry, Brian, I'll keep asking and you can keep
I'll keep trying.
answering.
Yeah, we will keep trying, and we're doing the best we can with what we've got.
We appreciate it, Andy.
Thank you.
So let me chime in a little bit. This is the kind of thing where we can look at industry data like utilities and manufacturing and other elements like that, where these kinds of efforts are embedded. So is it perfect? No, but it's at least a place we know generally where to look if you look at it from an industry level. So as the future unfolds with this act, we will have greater clarity in the future. But remember, this is a planning process. We know it's not going to be perfect, but what we'll be looking for in your plan is that it's on your radar, you're paying attention to it, and you're going to do whatever you can to help move the needle in these industries in your region. So that's what we're looking for, is like you're aware of it and you're paying attention to it, and you've got a game plan for dealing with it, regardless if the number for a particular industry or occupation is 1 or 1.3. We know that this kind of stuff is important, and we're keeping an eye on it. And I'll just respond to Steve's question in the chat. Is this a modification of the existing plan or a new plan? This is a new plan. The current plan that's in place was a modification that expires on June of 2024. So the new plan takes effect July 1.
Excellent. Do we have any other questions?
Antonio, this is Marty. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Great. I just want to reiterate, everybody, thank you for joining all of us today. And I had asked the labor market economists to join me on the call today. So I want to reiterate, Andy still has the image up with the regions, the economic development regions. So Logan, Tyra, can you just wave a hand to everybody? Great. Thanks, Logan. So he'll be the person to contact if you're in those regions 1, 2, and 3. Tom Austin has joined us today as well. Tom, if you want to wave a hand. Oh, and Andy, we're seeing some of your emails now. It flipped off the screen. Tom Austin is covering the economic development regions 4, 5, 6, and 10. And then one of our latest hires is Eric Michaela. Eric, if you can wave to everybody. Eric is covering, great, thanks, Eric, the southern region, so 7, 8, and 9. So myself and the team were, of course, all part of the Economic Information and Analysis Division here within IDES, and we will be serving your needs, whatever you direct to us and say, hey, we have some questions, we have some need for clarification, or if there's a very specific request, as Andy mentioned, we're trying to provide data for all regions, but in a very general way that will accomplish everyone's objectives. But we also know our regions are not monolithic. So your specific region may have a very direct need to look at a niche section or something very specific to your region. We are happy to try and fulfill those very kind of specific requests. In general, though, if we get a handful of you saying, well, we really would like some more information about wage data or something, we will most likely send those out to everybody and fulfill the request on a more global basis. So we will distribute this contact information that you're seeing on screen. We'll include that in the data packet that we're sending around for your review. That's just a draft version. Let me reiterate, it's for the central region. Of course, we have the data packets already compiled for all 10 regions, but we're hoping for your feedback before we finalize these by Halloween. So please send us your suggestions. We're here to support you and your WIOA efforts. So thanks for having us today.
All right. Does anybody else have any final comments before we close the session? No, doesn't look like it. Just a reminder that you will be getting a follow-up survey. If you could go ahead and fill that out whenever this is finished. We will also be sending out the recording, and we have the transcript available if anybody needs it. I hope you all have a wonderful day.
Thank you.
All right, we're going to go ahead and end the session. You have a wonderful day.